Would you have the courage to open a freezer hidden at the bottom of an underground tunnel? Now imagine finding bags labeled with people's names, and a smell you'd never forget. This is the story of a discovery that no one should make. If you dare, like and subscribe to the channel, because what I'm about to reveal is as disturbing as it is real. Working as an elite cleaner is something few people understand. When I tell people what most people imagine: glamour, spectacular mansions, designer, furniture, paradisiacal views. And in some ways, they're not wrong. I've walked on carpets that cost more than the house I grew up in, and cleaned chandeliers that sparkled like stars. But no one thinks about the dirty side, the real work behind the shine. Because when the rich and powerful need help, what they want is an evidence eraser. Someone to wash away their sins. I've seen things that would make anyone question what really goes on behind closed doors. Drug residue, syringes hidden in the most unlikely places, things you won't find in a regular store. Toys and accessories that the owners would probably deny to death, and sometimes live animals. I'm not talking about dogs or cats, but exotic creatures abandoned like leftovers from a wild night. I was good at my job, quiet, efficient, never asked questions. My job was to erase the chaos and restore order. But there is a price for this. Over time, you start to feel the weight of all those things you clean. Every mess has a story, and those stories stick with you. Like the smell of alcohol in a room that you can never ventilate properly. But no experience prepared me for that calling. It was supposed to be just another job. A special cleaning at the Beverly Hills mansion of one of the most influential figures in entertainment. My boss called, and his tone was more serious than usual. "This is confidential. No questions, no curiosity, just do the work." When I heard that, I should have refused. Something inside me knew this would be different. But the payoff was too good to ignore. I accepted. At the time, I had no idea that I was about to clean. Not just a house, but a secret that I should never have discovered. Getting a call to a mansion in Beverly Hills was nothing new to me. I've worked in properties that looked like modern palaces, where every wall and piece of furniture exuded money and power. But something about this work was different. From the beginning, my boss called me personally. Something rare, and got straight to the point. "We have an emergency. You need to take care of a basement. No questions asked. Just do the work." The tone in his voice was not one of ordinary urgency. It was as if he wanted to warn me without actually saying anything. The house in question was the mansion of none other than Diddy, one of the biggest icons in entertainment. I've heard stories about his parties, extravagant meetings, full of excesses where no one cared about limits. When I arrived, the scene was exactly what I imagined. Broken bottles on the floor, glasses scattered around, the smell of cigarettes, and something stronger permeating the air. The mansion was a spectacle in itself. Marble floors, huge chandeliers that reflected light like crystals, and walls decorated with modern art that probably cost more than a luxury car. But in the midst of it all, there was an uncomfortable feeling, as if something was out of place. The team leader met me at the entrance. He seemed nervous, which was unusual. "You'll look after the basement," he said, pointing to a staircase leading down to the side of the main room. The basement. It's never a good sign when you're directed to the basement. These places always hold the worst of the mess. Things people want to hide, things no one else wants to clean up. As soon as I started to descend, the smell changed. It was denser, damp, as if the air had been trapped there for years. I knew I was about to deal with something that wasn't just dirt. It was a special job, and special jobs always came with something heavier than dust or stains. At that moment, I had no idea that what awaited me was much more than I could handle. It wasn't just physical dirt, but dirt of the soul, something that would stay with me forever. When I reached the basement, I felt a shiver run up my back. The first thing I noticed was the difference in the environment. The mansion up there was spacious, full of light and luxury. Down here, it was a suffocating contrast. The low ceiling, the dark walls, and the air charged. It seemed like this place hadn't seen the outside world in years. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. The place had clearly been designed for exclusive parties, away from prying eyes. In the center, there was a small stage, with metal rods shining in the light. What happened there, I preferred not to imagine. The floor was covered in heel marks, drink stains, and something stickier that stuck to my shoes. Each step made an uncomfortable sound, as if the ground wanted to hold me there. A bar took up an entire side of the basement, but it was far from glamorous. The bottles were half full. Some had been knocked over, forming small pools of yellowish liquid. Residues of white powder were scattered across the count, like a silent confession of the excesses that had occurred. That night, an acrid smell came from the corners, as if something had been spilled and never cleaned up. On the other side of the basement, the furniture was in a deplorable state. Torn armchairs, sofas with dark stains that made me not want to get too close. There was a chair in the corner with a broken leg, as if someone had been thrown against it. This wasn't just dirt from a party. It seemed like the scene of something more violent, something that shouldn't be seen in the light of day. However, what bothered me most was the silence. Despite the chaotic state of the place, the silence was almost oppressive, as if the environment itself was waiting for something. Every sound I made, a shoe squeaking, the cloth sliding across the table seemed to echo endlessly. My instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. As I cleaned, the feeling of being watched began to bother me. There was no one there, at least that I could see. But that basement, it was like it had eyes of its own. Like every wall was alive, holding secrets I wasn't supposed to discover. At that moment, I didn't know what awaited me. All I knew was that something was wrong. Very wrong. I was cleaning behind the bar when I noticed something strange. The wooden panel didn't seem aligned with the rest. As I was wiping the cloth, I heard a slight click, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my heart race. I pushed the panel, and it slid smoothly to the side, revealing a trapdoor. The door was heavy, with rusty hinges and a lock that looked old, as if no one had used it in years. For a moment, I stood still, holding my breath. My instinct screamed to close it and continue my work, pretend I had never found anything. But there was something about that trapdoor, something that seemed to call to me. With shaking hands, I grabbed the latch and pulled it. The creaking of wood sounded like a scream in the silence of the basement. When the door finally opened, it revealed an iron staircase leading down into the darkness. The first thing I smelled was the smell. It was a heavy, dense smell, a mixture of mold, metal, and something else. Something I couldn't immediately identify. I took the flashlight that I always carry with me, an essential part of working in places like this, and illuminated the opening. The staircase descended until it disappeared into an oppressive darkness, as if it had no end. But I stared at the entrance for a few seconds, fighting a growing sense of panic. You shouldn't be doing this, I thought. But at the same time, curiosity grew inside me. Why was there a trapdoor hidden behind a basement bar? Why hadn't anyone mentioned this? Something didn't make sense, and I knew I needed to figure it out. With the flashlight in hand, I started to descend. Each step of the stairs creaked under my weight, and the echoes seemed to spread across a space larger than I could see. The metal was cold to the touch, and the air grew heavier with each step. My hands were sweating, and my mind wondered what I would find down there. Part of me expected to just find an old storage room, perhaps full of dusty boxes or forgotten things. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. When I finally reached the bottom, something changed. The absolute silence was replaced by a faint hum, almost like the sound of electricity. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a concrete wall covered in deep scratches, as if something had tried to break out of it. I wanted to climb back up at that moment, close the trapdoor, and never look at it again. But it was already too late. I had crossed an invisible boundary, and there was no turn. When my feet touched the concrete floor, the sensation was immediate. I was in a place that shouldn't exist. The tunnel was narrow, dimly lit by dim lights attached to the walls at intervals, long enough for darkness to fill the spaces between them. The flashlight shook in my hand, reflecting off the rough concrete walls, which looked dirty or stained with each step. The smell got worse. It was a mixture of mold, oxidized metal, and something more pungent, like rotting flesh. The sound of my footsteps echoed in a strange way, as if the tunnel had no end. My hands passed along the walls to guide me, and that's when I noticed deep scratches covered the concrete. Marks made by something or someone trying to get out. Some were small, as if human hands had tried to excavate the impossible. Others were so wide that I didn't even want to imagine what could have caused. I kept moving forward, my heart beating like a drum in my chest. After a few meters, the tunnel split. The dim light revealed two directions. To the left, a passage that disappeared into total darkness. On the right, something different. There was a metal door, large and rusty, with a small circular window at the top. My instinct screamed not to open that door, but something stronger, curiosity, or perhaps stupidity, forced me to continue. As I got closer, I saw something that made me hesitate. Dark stains ran down the door, forming dry trails down to the floor. It was hard to tell if it was blood or something worse, but the smell was unmistakable. I rested my hand on the cold doorknob, trying to muster the courage to open it. My reflection in the circular window seemed distorted, as if the glass was trying to warn me. With a firm push, the door creaked open. On the other side, I found something that made me gasp. A small room, dimly lit by a fluorescent light flickering from the ceiling. In the center, there was an industrial freezer. It was surrounded by steel shelves, with labeled boxes and containers. I took the flashlight beam and shined it into the freezer. On the outside, there were scratch marks, as if someone or something had tried to open it from the inside out. The tunnel seemed longer and darker than anything real, as if it existed somewhere else, a space outside of reality. Every step I took seemed to take me deeper, not just underground, but into something darker and more dangerous. I knew I had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer just a curious worker. I was an attacker in a place that should never have been discovered. As soon as I pushed the door open, I was hit by a wave of cold air, thick and oppressive, carrying a smell that was impossible to ignore. It was a mixture of rotten flesh, rust, and something sweet, which could only be described as the presence of death. The room was small, but it seemed larger in the almost absolute silence, where even the sound of my breathing echoed like a scream. The center of the room was dominated by an industrial freezer, huge and imposing, like a silver monolith that seemed out of place in that space. Its steel walls were stained with rust marks, but what really caught my attention were the deep scratches that covered the surface. They were long, jagged, and looked like they were made by human fingernails. Later, as I analyzed it, I felt a chill as I realized that the scratches were on the inside. Surrounding the freezer, metal shelves lined the walls, each carrying plastic, boxes and vacuum bags stacked in a methodical row. The labels on each item were handwritten in quick, irregular handwriting, as if the author was in a hurry or nervous. The names caught my attention immediately. Thomas, G. Rebecca, F. Mark, W. They weren't codes or brands, they were full, real names with surnames. I stood there for a moment, looking at the bags, trying to convince my mind that it wasn't what it seemed. Against all logic, I reached out and grabbed one. The plastic was cold and damp to the touch. I held it up toward the dim light, and when I could see what was inside, I almost dropped the bag. It was no ordinary meat. The texture felt wrong, like something that shouldn't be seen. It was a strange mask with shades that varied between dark red and yellowish gray, covered in small, dark veins that looked human. I choked, feeling my stomach drop. I returned the bag to its place and turned around. But something else caught my attention. Hanging on the wall is a corkboard, displaying photos. My hands shook as I shined the flashlight on the images. There were portraits of people, politicians, businessmen, celebrities. But something was terribly wrong. They were sitting or standing, but their poses were unnatural, as if they had been forced into this. The most disturbing thing was the expression on their faces. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pain. It was empty, a complete absence of life in the eyes. Some of the photos were marked with dark spots, smudges that looked like dried splashes of liquid. My hands shook more when I recognized a face. He was a well-known politician, recently involved in a public scandal before mysteriously disappearing from the media. Next to him was a celebrity whose death had been ruled an overdose months earlier. Then I noticed another detail pinned to the corner of the board. A yellowed, worn sheet of paper had something written on it in thin, slanted handwriting. The message was short, but enough to freeze me. Invitation only. I tried to move away, but there was still the freezer. Against all common sense, I decided to open. My hands were sweaty and cold, and the latch didn't give easily. When I finally did, the sound was like a metallic scream that echoed through the room. Inside, the neat rows of vacuum bags were even more disturbing in the direct light. There were dozens of them. Each one has a label with different names. My mind tried to find an explanation, but the emptiness in my chest told me there was nothing logical there. Suddenly, a low sound broke the silence. A creaking noise coming from behind me. I turned quickly, pointing the flashlight at the door. Nothing. The room was quiet, but now I was sure I wasn't alone. The air felt heavier, almost palpable, and the sound of my heart beating filled my ears. I needed to get out of there, but the worst was yet to come. After closing the freezer, I forced myself to leave that room. My entire body was tense, and each step felt more difficult than the last. Still, I continued forward through the tunnel, lighting the way with the flashlight. The air became heavier, almost suffocating, and the smell changed. What was once rotten flesh and rust now had a hint of burnt wax, mixed with something I couldn't identify. The tunnel opened into another room, larger than the previous one, but much more disturbing. The walls were covered in symbols, drawn in dark red, almost brown. They looked ancient, but something about the pattern seemed human, as if they had been made hastily, with an intention that was not just decorative. The dim light from my flashlight danced across the outlines of the symbols, and I could almost feel that they were pulsing. In the center of the room was a large, worn wooden table. Above it, a collection of objects that seemed to come out of a nightmare. Knives with curved blades were aligned precisely, some stained with something dry and dark. Melted candles, their strange shapes giving the impression of distorted faces, were scattered across the tabletop. Beside them were old books with cracked leather-covered covers and pages that looked like they were about to fall apart. Even without opening them, I knew that those words were not for ordinary eyes. It was then that I saw the cages. They were attached to the back walls, too small for any large animal. Each cage had chains hanging from it with handcuffs at the end. I approached with the flashlight shaking in my hand and noticed nail marks on the inside. Of the bars, some were deep, tearing off chunks of rusty metal, while others were so small they looked like children had made them. My stomach turned. The worst, however, was in the small, dark puddles under each cage. The smell was unmistakable. Iron, strong and metallic. Blood. It wasn't recent, but it wasn't old enough to have disappeared completely. The thought of someone or something being held there made me instinctively recoil. As my eyes roamed the room, I noticed more details. In the corner, hanging from metal hooks, were white robes. They were spotlessly clean, except for the bars, which were stained red. They looked like uniforms, ceremonial clothes from a ritual whose purpose I didn't want to understand. The feeling of being watched came back with a vengeance. I turned quickly, pointing the flashlight at each corner of the room, but there was nothing there, or at least nothing that my eyes could see. The silence was so deep that I could hear my own heart beating. I wanted to leave, but something told me that if I ran, what was watching me might finally show itself. Backing up slowly, I tried to move away from the table and cages without making any noise. When I reached the door, I took one last look at the room and noticed something I had ignored before. Marks on the floor in perfect circles, almost as if the concrete had been burned. They were arranged around the table like a pattern. And then, finally, the only thing I thought was, I need to get out of here. Now, I had seen enough. My hands were shaking, my heart was beating like a drum in my chest, and every cell in my body was screaming to get out of there. I tried to walk out of the tunnel as fast as I could without run, but the ground felt more unstable with each step. The flashlight illuminated the path, but the light seemed dimmer, as if something in that place was draining even her energy. The tunnel that had previously seemed narrow now seemed to close around me. The shadows lengthened and danced as if they were alive, distorting what little reality I could still grasp. The air was heavier, suffocating, and the smell that permeated the place was no longer just mold or rotting meat. It was something indescribable, like a combination of death and despair. Suddenly, I heard something behind me. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was enough to paralyze me. A low, almost imperceptible creak, like metal being dragged against the floor. I turned quickly, pointing the flashlight behind me, but there was nothing. Just the empty tunnel and the darkness. Or at least that's what it seemed like. I continued walking, faster now, trying to shake off the growing panic. Each step felt like a challenge, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Finally, I saw the iron staircase that would take me back to the basement. I ran towards it, not caring about the noise it made. As I started to climb, I had felt like something was pulling me back. Even though nothing physical was touching me, it was a presence, an invisible weight that seemed to say, "You shouldn't have come here." When I reached the basement, the dim light in the room was like a punch of reality. For a brief moment, I felt like I was safe, but the feeling quickly passed. I looked around, trying to compose myself, but everything seemed different. The basement, which had previously been just a rundown, messy place, now seemed to pulse with an energy that I hadn't noticed before. It was as if that place was also alive, connected to what was below. I tried to finish my work as quickly as possible, cleaning automatically without really paying attention to what I was doing. All I wanted was to get out of there. When I finally finished, I rose to the surface. The house was quieter than before, almost surreal. The remaining cleaning crew didn't seem to notice anything amiss, but I knew I would never forget what was down there. As I left the mansion, I saw something that made me stop for a moment. At the entrance, several blue vans were parked, and uniformed men were unloading boxes of pizza. They were silent, moving in an organized, almost mechanical way. Something about it felt wrong. Why so many pizzas? Who had asked for them? However, I didn't have the strength to think about it anymore. My mind was saturated with questions, but my body just wanted to get out of that place. As I got into my car, I looked at the mansion one last time. The lights were still on, as if nothing had happened. But I knew that place hid something that could never be explained. I started the engine and drove away, but the feeling that something had followed me did not leave me. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and fear. At first, I tried to rationalize everything I saw, convincing myself that it was just my exaggerated imagination. Perhaps they were the remains of a more eccentric party than usual. Maybe the photos were a coincidence. But the more I tried to forget, the more the details came back, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to disappear. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. I was in the kitchen drinking my coffee when I looked out the window. A black SUV was parked across the street. It had tinted windows, and no one inside seemed to want to leave. At first I thought it was just someone standing there, but the car sat there for hours. Even when I went out shopping, he was still there. That night, as I was trying to sleep, my phone rang. The number was unknown, and against my better judgment, I answered. On the other end of the line, a calm, emotionless male voice said, "Thank you for your work. Remember, our customers value privacy." Before I could respond, the call ended. My heart sank, and the weight of what that meant fell on me. They knew who I was. They were watching me. I spent the next few days feeling like I was being followed. Everywhere I went, it seemed like black SUVs were always lurking. They never did anything. They didn't approach me. They didn't talk to me. But their mere presence was suffocating. I began to notice small details. Footsteps behind me on deserted streets. A figure standing on the side of the store where I was shopping. A shadow that seemed to watch me through the window. At night, I could no longer ignore what I saw. I decided to research the names on the labels, on the bags in the freezer, and in the photos on the board. My curiosity overcame my fear. What I found only made things worse. Each name was linked to something dark. Hushed scandals, unexplained disappearances, suicides that never made sense. It was as if everyone had been swallowed by something bigger, something that no one dared to expose. The faces in the photos also started appearing in my dreams. I saw those empty eyes, the lifeless expressions, and I woke up in a cold sweat. My nights were filled with nightmares, in which I was trapped in that tunnel, unable to escape, while something invisible watched me. One day I came home and found an envelope on my door. There was no sender, but inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in large, handwritten letters, were the words, "Don't tell anyone." The meaning was clear. They knew I was thinking about speaking out, maybe even reporting it, and they were warning me. It was the last straw. I decided to quit my job and move far away, to a small town where no one knew me. But even now, away from that mansion, I still feel their presence. Sometimes I see SUVs driving slowly down my street, even though they have no reason to be there. The anonymous calls continue, but they never say anything other than a heavy silence. It feels like I'm stuck in a game. I should never have played it. Maybe they're just watching me to make sure I stay silent. Or maybe they are waiting for the right moment to make me disappear. Like so many others whose names were in that room, I abandoned my old life. I left work. I walked away from everything. I thought that by putting distance between myself and that mansion, I would finally be able to sleep without hearing the echoes of my footsteps in that tunnel. But the memories didn't leave me. They are all always there, lurking, waiting for moments of silence to attack me. I can't forget what I saw. The freezer, the photos, the names, the marks on the cages. Worse than all this was the silence. Not ordinary silence, but that kind of emptiness that carries something alive. Something that watches. Something that takes pleasure in being encountered by someone who should never have seen it. I tried to move on, but my mind is stuck in that mansion. Sometimes, on quieter nights, I start to connect the dots. The names, the faces in the photos, the stories of disappearances and hushed-up scandals. The more I research, the clearer it becomes that what I saw was part of something much bigger. something that should never have been discovered. What scares me most is not what I already know, but what I haven't fully understood. Those symbols on the walls, the marks on the floor, the empty faces. None of it seemed human. It was as if I had entered a space that did not belong to our world. As if that mansion was a portal to something much deeper, older, and infinitely more dangerous. Even today, I see black SUVs driving slowly down my street. I feel like I'm being watched, that my words are being monitored. But at the same time, I ask myself, why am I alive? Why did they let me go? Did they think I was insignificant? Is the fear I feel enough to guarantee silence? Either way, I need to warn people. There are things that happen behind the doors of the mansions of the rich and powerful, that challenge everything we think we know about the world. They hide secrets that consume lives, destroy reputations, and feed on the silence of those like me, who have seen too much. And you? Do you believe the world is as simple as it seems? Or do you think there are places where power and money create monsters that should never exist? If these stories spark your curiosity, subscribe to the channel, like and share this video. Let's explore together what's hidden in the shadows. Because what we don't know can be scarier than any nightmare.